It's gone. Two words we never want to hear about Connecticut's environment. Fortunately, there are efforts in every town to make sure these words are never spoken. Preserving Connecticut introduces you to these efforts and the people behind them.
I work on land preservation. I'm crazy about the issue of open space conservation because I think it benefits all parts of my district. It's the views and the vistas and the ecological habitats that are protected through open space are certainly important to Litchfield County and the Farmington Valley, where the character of those communities are directly tied to the open spaces around them. But the preservation of those open spaces is really important to places like Meriden and Waterbury and New Britain, because to the extent that we can start to tamp down on the urban sprawl that has sort of been ongoing in Connecticut for a long time, it provides incentives to reinvest in our urban cores. And so as we take off of the roles of potential development big parcels of land in Litchfield County, it has the effect of creating more pressure on policy makers and state government officials to invest in housing and infrastructure in our urban core.
My name is Mary Habermail, and I'm president of the Bethlehem Land Trust in Bethlehem, Connecticut. I've been involved with the Land Trust about 6 years. I got involved because there was a piece of property down the road that I was very fond of. I'd spent a lot of time on as a child, as my whole family had, and it was for sale. So I contacted someone I knew on the board, and it turns out that this gentleman had tried to save this piece prior, and I said, well, let's try again. I moved here in the early 80s. There were 26 dairy farms at that time, and there's, I think, 2 or 3 left now. On a stretch of road just up the hill here, in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been about 15 houses built. We have a lot of open space on the other side of town in terms of the few dairy farms that are left, and some that aren't dairy farms but are still open. But it's prime development. It's prime development land, and when the economy gets back on its feet, developers are going to come to Bethlehem. New homeowners are going to come to Bethlehem. People that want to put businesses in their yard are coming to Bethlehem.
Joseph Wolukitis' family, they bought it in 1929 from the Howard family. So they bought it during the Great Depression, and they've owned it right up till a year ago. And he passed away, he was 91. It's like our family's been intertwined through, I'm going to say, he goes back to my grandfather. So him and my grandfather went to school together as little kids when they used to walk to school or ride the horse. So, I mean, it's been a great thing. And when we, like I said, showed up here in '96, Joe said, here's the farm if you want to make it work. He was tired and couldn't do much. And at that time, he was in his 70s, close to 80s. And he said, I just can't go on anymore. And he didn't want it to just fall by the wayside. He built a beautiful barn, picked the fields. Everything he built, I mean, he built this farm pretty much by hand. So it's pretty neat that somebody could put that time and effort into it. And to me, it's more like a monument to that kind of work. So I'd like to keep doing that, and hopefully his trust in me and my wife and my family, by turning it over to us after he had passed on, we will be able to keep doing that, kind of build off of that and keep it going for hopefully for the next few generations as my sons come of age, and hopefully they choose to do something in the field of agriculture with it.
In my district, we do a lot of dairy farming, but we do some other farming as well. And small-scale dairy farming is getting harder and harder to do. It's a labor of love, and for the families that still do it, it's largely because it's important to them and it's important to their families, not because it's making them rich. And so the pressure is on a lot of these farms and families to do what is most financially feasible for them, which is to sell the land, part or all of it, for development. In Connecticut, they can fetch a pretty handsome price for it. That's why a lot of our conservation programs, in particular our farmland preservation programs, are designed to, in the short run, through the purchase of conservation rights to the land, provide some cash infusion to the family. They get some money to help make ends meet and help continue to run the farm. And the community and the taxpayers get the benefit of that land being put into permanent conservation status.
Conservation is entirely about values. It's about what we care about, and each of us has a different take on that.
Catherine, my wife, is in a unique position, and that's she's a 7th generation descendant of the initial settler. The homestead that he started is still there. The lands that he worked and not only eked out a living on, but actually prospered through hard work, is still there. When you look at an open field that you get your hay from, or that you bush hog each year and use as pasture, you realize that field was cleared not with chainsaws or tractors or bulldozers. It was cleared with oxen and axes and sweat and broken knuckles. It was, and keeping that land open has been if someone's put that energy into opening that up, you keep it open. You don't let it come back as successional forest. You use it. We can go over, and one field is called the Widow Hannah because that was her place where she kept her animals. Or I can show you where they used to harvest oats and give you a late 1800s photograph of them harvesting oats with scythes, because they couldn't even get a wagon in there. It was a wet parcel. It's still wet today, but it's still open today. Goat pastures, orchards that are still there, the remnants of orchards with trees still producing apples. The fruits of the labor of past generations is all there. The old red house is like a museum. It was never modified. I mean, it had plumbing put in it probably in the 50s. It was electrified maybe in the 60s. It's an antique, and the kitchen wood cook stove is still there and still used, especially for heat in the winter. So there's a sense of place that I think a lot of people don't share. And again, it's very hard to look at a place with that background as a commodity. Well, we could get so much for this acre or that acre, we could slice and dice it with the realtors who are always anxious to get in the door. There's a sense of place and identity. That's the other, I guess that's really what it boils down to, is who you are, who your people were, what the land is a part of your identity, becomes a part of your identity. When successive generations have gotten all their food and fiber from that land, it's more than a commodity. It's the source of your well-being. It's the sustainer of your family.
Saving family land is my business, and helping my family save its land was the greatest thing I've really ever done. The feeling of satisfaction that 4 generations on, we didn't have to sell. This is one of the hardest things that anyone does, because people who are used to making business decisions, high finance, running large enterprises, have trouble when it's their place, when it's their grandfather's barn, when it's their sister and their cousin. And a lot of this, doing the right thing for families as well as the land, is what is most meaningful for me and most sustainable. So when I talk to people about why you might consider it, even beyond the possible tax advantages that there may be, even beyond the doing good things for the environment, it is such a relief to be the ones who made the long-term choice for special places that have been important to people in your family. And the peace that comes from that is simply extraordinary.
My sister and I are putting a conservation easement on our property here in Bethlehem. It's approximately 70 acres. My grandfather bought this property in 1929. We love it dearly. We would like to see it remain open space. We would hope that someday our kids will stay here and maybe farm it. We are starting a small beef operation. Whether the children continue with that, I don't know. But regardless of what happens in the future, we would like to see this land remain as open space.
Well, the federal government has always been a really important player in land preservation, and Connecticut has taken advantage of it. In my first term, with a large federal grant, we were able to preserve an incredibly important parcel in Kent, Connecticut on Skiff Mountain. But it was a great example of how the federal dollars are not and cannot be the sum total of preservation efforts. In that case, we were able to put together state dollars, federal dollars, and the generosity of a group of private landholders that were willing to discount the purchase of their property, of the conservation rights to their property.
You look at the landscape around us and it looks intact. You see trees, you see little nestled houses, but in fact most of it is divided up by driveways, by infrastructure. It's not the huge expanse of unfragmented forest in most places that it appears, but on Skiff Mountain, that's different. There you have a resource that's regionally significant, where there's more than 30,000 acres of trees without those major inholdings and cutouts across 2 states. It's in multiple ownerships. It's not that you have 1 or 2 big timber companies that owns the whole thing. It's many different properties, many different interests, many different landowners. What was significant about it was that you couldn't conserve 800 acres in one pass, that it required 6 different families to get it done.
And I have to say that I admire these people's land stewardship ethos, because they could have gotten an enormously larger amount of money if they had sold it for subdivision. And they were willing to forego that profit. And in my mind, Chris, the difference is how you look at the place you live, what your sense of place is. If you see land as a commodity, then you can wring as much money as you can out of it with no moral problems. If you see it as an asset, as the Forest Legacy Program does, this is where our oxygen comes from. This is where our clean, pure water comes from, the filtration through these lands. This is where our wildlife habitat is. This land serves much more important purposes than the money you could get for it for development, although they're not as tangible as cash in the hand to most people. They have a very short vision and a short time frame in their thinking. If I look 20, 40, 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road, if the legal system's still intact, this land is in conservation easement in perpetuity. I know that's a legal fiction, and who knows what the future will hold, but it's a step in the right direction.
But that's the thumb on the bottom of the Taconic Ridge. They arose a little bit later, geologically speaking. They used to be 20,000 feet high. Little pieces of Indian Mountain are conserved, but most of it's not. So if you look at this landscape, we've got the foreground here, protected for agricultural and scenic purposes. We've got the middle ground, protected for agricultural and scenic resources, but the background is conserved only because the landowners have not decided to do anything like that with it, to build on it or permanently set it aside.
I've looked at most of the town plans for the northwest corner towns in Connecticut, although they're having the same problems in the northeast corner. And in every town plan there are copious references to maintaining the rural character of your place. Nowhere is that rural character defined. The elements of rural character are not quantified or defined. So it's what linguists would call an open signifier. If I speak to a group of 100 people and say we must maintain our rural character, 100 heads will nod in agreement, but in each mind there'll be a different image of what that rural character is. So it's very important to define those elements of rural character.
Starting to recognize that some of what makes this area so extraordinary isn't going to persist over time without our first knowing where it is, and secondly being thoughtful about how we interact with it. This is not a no more building idea, but it is that in some places those long driveways that go up hills impact far more than just the trees you cut down. If it's the wrong section of forest, you've broken it in half, it no longer has the ecological function. Likewise, in some of our communities, we haven't yet thought about what makes it walkable and livable. In my town, which has got 3,300 people in it, there are little pieces of sort of assumed open space that people's backyards look at that will have 3 houses in them eventually. But there they are. And much of the attention of conservation has tended to be the hills, the wetlands. Increasingly now we're looking at farms. But we need to think about those areas too. The purpose of the Housatonic Valley Association is the conservation of an entire watershed in 3 states and those things that make its community special. Within it is the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative that I direct, which is focused on Northwest Connecticut in 28 communities with over 20 land trusts. And the idea behind it was that each of us is doing great work, but not keeping pace with the kind of development pressure that we experienced and will experience again. The vision of the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative is that the ecological integrity of this landscape and the character of our communities persists over time and endures for generations to come. And the only way that happens is intentionality. We have no regional planning to speak of. We do have some very good and talented planners, but that's not where the state's made its investment. We have organized ourselves town by town, land trust by land trust. There's a huge gap between what an individual community perceives as its options and resources and priorities, and what the state may have or not have to contribute to that. By default, then, the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative has become kind of a regional organizing intelligence, grassroots, driven from the bottom up, working through its members, but providing necessary information and talent and resources as we start to fundraise for each other's projects that otherwise would not be there. 20 years from now, if we're successful at this very novel approach to working and conserving together, all that you see around you, the forests, the waters, the farms that still are the heart of our communities, will be secured through a combination of land protection, of better policy, and some very creative project work. We think we need about 70,000 acres additional protected land through the work of all of us. And that's going to be a tall order, but I think achievable. If a community like Bethlehem has a couple $100,000 that could be used for better conservation, I might make a couple suggestions. One is, think hard about what it is about your community that's truly irreplaceable. Is it that hard to define rural character? Is it an agricultural landscape in the eastern part of town that has some of the best farmland soils and densest concentration in the state? Is it the feel that neighbors have walking on particular roads? And think hard about what's going to happen if there isn't a focused effort to ensure that those resources persist over time. I don't mean buy it all up, but have a plan. Have a plan for the 10 places, if not parcels, that are really indispensable to the character and values that you hold in your community, and that you'd rather weren't degraded or developed in ways that compromise that. Have a conversation. Use some of the money you have to really get down to what the citizens in your community value and care about. If you've got a plan of conservation and development that did not involve a very detailed survey of local values and attitudes, get one. It's politically empowering to know what people care about. It also helps to focus your own attention. People love where they live. Doesn't matter where it is. They care about the quality of life that they experience there. They differ on how to keep it. I think that's where we break down politically. There are some people who see a stronger role in government and regulation. There's some people who think it's got to be private initiative. I say you need a combination of both, but without an understanding of why you have what you have, what's at risk, what's going to keep it that way, you'll just muddle through. Connecticut has, I think, about 125 different land trusts. It's one of the densest concentrations of nonprofit conservation organizations in the country. And they range from brand new, like the Morris Land Trust or the Heartland Land Trust, to venerable institutions that have been around for 60 or 70 years. Houstonic Valley Association came into existence in 1941. There were a whole bunch of land trusts that came into being in the late 80s and early 90s when the IRS codified conservation easements as legitimate tax deductions. And so entities that could hold those restrictions on private land, where people gave up their development rights in perpetuity in exchange, in some cases, for an income tax deduction, proliferated.
But there are other tools that the federal government has, primarily tax policy. Over the years, in part thanks to the efforts of my predecessor in this job, Nancy Johnson, Congress has authorized a preferential tax treatment for landowners who put their land into conservation, that you can take an increased deduction above the usual deduction for a donation if you're donating conservation rights to land. We've extended that, that tax incentive on an annual basis. I would love to make it permanent, and it has resulted in hundreds, if not thousands, of acres in Connecticut being put into conservation because the owners of that land get a tax benefit for keeping it in conservation. So
there is a law in Congress right now that hopefully will be voted on this week, which is May, in the end of May, that will give the tax advantage of 50% of your accumulated gross income over 15 years. That's the tax advantage. If that doesn't pass, the tax law would be 30% of your accumulated gross income for 5 years. The conservation community would like to see the larger advantage be a permanent law, but right now we're just shooting to get that extended through the end of 2010. For farmers, if they give their land, if they give a conservation easement on their land, they can write off with the higher incentive. They can write off the taxes on their total gross income. They have to prove they're an active farm, and that's a large incentive for farmers. If you give land in your will, it helps your heirs. You could put it in conservation easement at the time of your death, and that will save your heirs some of the inheritance taxes. Or you can give it in fee give it to the conservation organization on your death. All of these have tax advantages. Any individual would have to talk to their lawyer and financial advisor to find out which works best for them.
In order to achieve a conservation vision of 70,000 acres of farms, forest, fresh drinking water resources conserved in the next 20 years, we have to double the rate at which we've been doing that. We have to find the resources within ourselves, the creativity. We have to be willing to talk to each other about things like donors who live in different towns but might care about something where we are. We have to figure out how to do land deals that involve thoughtful development where appropriate. And we can and we are. One of the things I love about this work is just getting the chance to talk about what each of us cares about from a land trust perspective or from a citizen perspective or from a municipal perspective shows how much we've got in common. We're not that different. We are unique, but we are not that different. And I have seen marvelous things come from just those conversations. People are starting to dream bigger.